The crash happened at exactly 7:42 in the morning on a stretch of coastal highway that most people only drove when they wanted to feel small against the ocean. Mark Richards wasn't trying to feel small. He was trying to get his 6-year-old daughter to school on time, his rusted pickup truck groaning against the salt air, the check engine light glowing orange like a warning he'd learned to ignore months ago. Sophie sat in the passenger seat clutching her lunchbox, a dented metal thing decorated with faded butterflies, humming a song she'd learned in music class while Mark calculated whether he had enough gas to make it to the school and back to the construction site where his shift started at 8. The math wasn't good. It never was these days. Since Karen died 2 years ago, leaving him with a mountain of medical bills and a daughter who still sometimes called out for mommy in her sleep, the math had become a daily exercise in impossible choices: pay the electric bill or buy groceries, fix the truck's transmission or hope it lasted another month. Give Sophie the childhood she deserved or watch her grow up too fast, learning lessons about scarcity that no 6-year-old should have to learn. He was doing that math in his head, weighing gas prices against the detour he'd taken to clear his thoughts when he saw it happen. The white Porsche came around the bend too fast, its driver overcorrecting on a patch of loose gravel, and then time seemed to stretch like taffy as the car spun once, twice, before slamming sideways into the guardrail with a sound that would echo in Mark's dreams for weeks. The rail buckled but held, leaving the car teetering at an impossible angle, its front wheels hanging over the cliff's edge while smoke began pouring from beneath the crumpled hood. Mark's foot was on the brake before his mind caught up with his body. "Stay in the truck," he told Sophie, his voice carrying that particular firmness that she knew better than to question. "Don't move. Don't look. I'll be right back." "Daddy, is the car going to fall?" "I don't know, baby, but I need you to stay here. Can you do that for me?" Sophie nodded, her small hands tightening on the butterfly lunchbox. Her eyes were wide, but she didn't cry. She'd learned not to cry at things that scared her, another lesson Mark wished she didn't have to know. He was out of the cab and running before she could say anything else, his worn work boots slapping against asphalt still wet with morning dew. The Porsche groaned against the damaged guardrail, metal scraping metal in a sound that set his teeth on edge. Through the spider-webbed windshield he could see her, a woman slumped over the steering wheel, blonde hair matted with blood from a gash on her forehead, completely still. The driver's side door was crushed inward, impossible to open. Mark circled to the passenger side, feeling the car shift beneath his weight as he pulled himself onto the tilted frame. Every movement sent tremors through the vehicle, and he could hear the guardrail groaning in protest, the metal bolts straining against concrete that wasn't designed to hold this much lateral pressure. The door handle resisted, then gave way with a shriek of protest. The smell hit him first, gasoline and copper and something burning that told him he had minutes at best, maybe less. The woman wasn't moving. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse, and found nothing. No heartbeat, no breath. Just silence where life should have been. He didn't think. Thinking was a luxury for people who had time to spare, and time was bleeding out of this moment faster than the fuel leaking from the ruptured tank. He unclipped her seatbelt, wrapped his arms around her torso, and pulled. She was lighter than he expected, her body limp and unresisting as he dragged her across the center console and out through the passenger door. The car groaned again, tipping further toward the edge, and Mark stumbled backward with her weight in his arms, landing hard on the asphalt with her body sprawled across his chest. Pain shot through his shoulder, his hip, his back. He ignored it. Behind them, the Porsche finally surrendered to gravity, sliding forward with an almost gentle grace before disappearing over the cliff. The explosion came 3 seconds later, a bloom of orange and black that painted the morning sky with violence, the heat washing over them even at this distance. But Mark wasn't watching. He was already rolling her onto her back, tilting her head, pinching her nose, pressing his mouth to hers and forcing breath into lungs that had forgotten how to draw air on their own. 1 breath, 2. Then his hands were on her chest, finding the rhythm that every construction site safety course had drilled into him, Compressions that felt too violent against her ribs but were the only chance she had. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. Come on, he whispered between cycles. Come on, stay with me. You're not dying here. Not like this. Not today. His arms burned. His back screamed from the impact with the ground. Somewhere behind him, Sophie was crying, having disobeyed his order to look away, her small voice calling Daddy, Daddy over and over like a prayer or a plea or both at once. He didn't stop. Couldn't stop. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. The woman's chest rose and fell with his forced air, but nothing else happened. No cough, no gasp, no flutter of returning life. Mark's vision blurred with sweat and something that might have been tears, his entire world narrowing to this single impossible task. This stranger whose face he barely registered, whose name he didn't know, whose life had somehow become the only thing that mattered in this moment. And then, just as his arms began to fail him, just as the despair started to creep in around the edges of his determination, she convulsed. Her whole body jerked beneath his hands, her back arching off the asphalt as she sucked in air with a sound like drowning in reverse. Her eyes flew open, wide and wild, and the most startling shade of green he'd ever seen, fixing on his face with an expression of pure terror. "You're okay," Mark said, his voice cracking with relief. "You're okay. You were in an accident. You stopped breathing. You had to what?" Her voice was thin and reedy, scraped raw by whatever damage the impact had done to her throat. She tried to sit up, winced, and fell back against the ground. "I had to give you CPR." Mark sat back on his heels, suddenly aware of how close he was to her, of the intimacy of what had just passed between them. Her blood was on his shirt. The taste of her lipstick lingered on his mouth. "I'm sorry if I scared you, but you weren't breathing. I didn't have a choice." She stared at him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face with an intensity that made him want to look away. Then she asked a question that landed like a stone in still water. "Why did you kiss me?" Mark blinked. It was CPR. You understand what CPR is, right? Her brow furrowed, confusion and something else flickering across her features. "CPR," she repeated slowly as if testing the word. "You put your mouth on mine and breathed into me. That's what CPR is, to save your life." "Yes." She was quiet for another moment, processing. Then, so softly he almost didn't hear it, she whispered, "No one's ever done that for me before." Mark didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. In the distance, he could hear sirens beginning to wail, emergency services finally responding to what must have been a dozen frantic calls from other drivers who'd witnessed the crash. Sophie had stopped crying, but when he looked back at his truck, she was standing outside the cab, her butterfly lunchbox abandoned on the ground, her face pale and streaked with tears. "Daddy," she called, her voice small and scared. "Is the lady going to be okay?" Mark turned back to the woman who was still watching him with those penetrating green eyes. She managed a weak smile, then raised her voice enough for Sophie to hear. "I'm going to be okay, sweetheart, because of your daddy." The ambulance arrived 4 minutes later, followed by 2 police cars and a fire truck whose crew could only stare at the burning wreckage at the bottom of the cliff and shake their heads in disbelief. Paramedics swarmed the woman, loading her onto a stretcher despite her protests that she was fine, that she just needed to make a phone call, that she had a meeting in an hour that she absolutely could not miss. Mark gave his statement to a young officer who seemed more interested in the dramatic details than the facts. He refused the medical attention they offered, insisting that he was fine, that he needed to get his daughter to school, that there was nothing wrong with him that a hot shower and a strong cup of coffee wouldn't fix. It wasn't until the ambulance was pulling away that he realized he'd never asked the woman's name. He watched the vehicle disappear down the highway, its lights still flashing, and felt something settle in his chest that he couldn't quite identify. "Daddy," Sophie tugged at his sleeve, "we're going to be late." Mark looked down at his daughter, at her worried face and her grass-stained knees and her butterfly lunchbox now clutched back in her hands. He looked at his truck, at the construction site waiting for him, at the life that demanded his immediate attention regardless of what had just happened. "Yeah, baby," he said. "We probably are." He didn't think about the woman again until that evening, when Sophie was asleep and he was sitting alone at the kitchen table paying bills he couldn't afford. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the street below. Mark had a system for the bills, one he'd developed over 2 years of impossible choices, essential on the left, important in the middle, everything else on the right. Tonight, the essential pile was bigger than usual, and the checking account balance was smaller. His phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. He almost didn't answer, assuming it was another robocall about his car's extended warranty, another reminder that even his phone didn't respect his time or his peace. But something made him pick up anyway. "Hello?" There was a pause on the other end, then a voice he recognized from that morning, stronger now but still carrying the memory of broken glass and burning metal. "This is the man who saved my life." Her statement wasn't a question. "This is Mark Richards," he said. "Yes, I never got your name." Another pause, longer this time. When she spoke again, there was something different in her tone, something almost vulnerable beneath the polished confidence. "My name is Melissa Court." Mark's hand tightened on the phone. Melissa Court was a name he knew, a name everyone knew, the kind of name that appeared on buildings and scholarship funds and the business section of newspapers. She was the CEO of Court Industries, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies on the West Coast, a billionaire whose face had graced the covers of magazines he couldn't afford to buy. "I wanted to thank you," she continued, "properly. The hospital told me what you did, how long you performed CPR before I started breathing again. The doctors said another 30 seconds and I would have suffered permanent brain damage. Another minute and I would have been gone. I just did what anyone would do." "No." Her voice was firm now, the voice of someone accustomed to being believed, to having her words treated as facts rather than opinions. "You did what almost no one does. You stopped. You risked your life. You refused to give up even when it seemed hopeless. That's not nothing, Mr. Richards. That's everything." He didn't know how to respond to that, so he redirected. "How did you get my number? I have resources." She said it simply, without arrogance, a statement of fact rather than a boast. "I also have questions. Why was a man in a truck that looked like it was held together with duct tape and prayers driving on that stretch of highway at 7 in the morning with a child in the passenger seat?" Mark's jaw tightened. "I was taking my daughter to school. Most people don't take the coastal route to school. It adds 20 minutes. It was a detour. I needed to think." "About what? About whether I could afford to keep the heat on this month and still buy her new shoes. Her current ones have holes in the soles." There was silence on the other end of the line, and Mark immediately regretted his honesty. He hadn't meant to say that, hadn't meant to reveal the precariousness of his situation to a woman whose net worth probably had more zeros than he could count. "I'm sorry," he said. "That's not your problem. I'm not going to—" "Mr. Richards, when did you last eat a meal that wasn't something from your daughter's lunchbox?" Mark opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. The question was too precise, too knowing, as if she'd somehow glimpsed the shape of his life in those brief moments on the highway, read the story of his struggle in the lines around his eyes or the patches on his work clothes. "That's what I thought," she said. "I'd like to offer you something. Before you say no, I want you to understand that this isn't charity. This isn't pity. This is a debt, and I always pay my debts." "I don't want your money," Mark said, even as his eyes drifted to the stack of bills in front of him, the numbers that didn't add up no matter how many times he calculated them. "I'm not offering money. Not directly. I'm offering a job." He almost laughed. "I'm a construction worker, Miss Court. I don't have a college degree. I barely finished high school. What could I possibly do for a pharmaceutical company?" "You could keep me alive," she said simply. "I need a new head of security. My previous one was incompetent, obviously, given that I nearly died this morning because no one thought to check the weather conditions on my usual route. I need someone who pays attention, who notices things, who acts without hesitation when something is wrong. You demonstrated all of those qualities in the span of 3 minutes. I'll train you. I'll provide everything you need, and I'll pay you more in a month than you currently make in a year. Mark sat very still, his mind racing. This was insane. This was the kind of thing that happened in movies, not in real life, not to people like him. People like him struggled and scraped and eventually died, still struggling and scraping, leaving nothing behind but debt and a daughter who deserved better than what he could give her. "You don't know anything about me," he said. "I know you have a 6-year-old daughter named Sophie who likes butterflies and hums when she's nervous. I know you drive a 2003 Ford F-150 with 187,000 miles on it. I know you've been working construction for 8 years and have never missed a day of work despite multiple injuries. I know your wife died 3 years ago from cancer and you've been raising Sophie alone ever since, working double shifts when you can get them, selling plasma when you can't. And I know that when you saw a stranger in danger this morning, you didn't think about any of that. You just acted. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." The silence stretched between them, telephone wire and miles and every choice Mark had ever made leading to this moment. "I need to think about it," he finally said. "Of course. Take your time." "But Mr. Richards—" She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer than it had been. "Whatever you decide, please know that what you did this morning mattered. You gave me back my life. I won't forget that." She hung up before he could respond, leaving him alone with the weight of her words and the stack of bills and the sound of Sophie breathing softly in the room down the hall. 3 days passed before Mark made his decision. 3 days of pouring concrete and hammering nails and pretending that his entire world hadn't tilted on its axis. 3 days of Sophie asking about the pretty lady from the accident, of his co-workers slapping his back and calling him a hero, of news vans showing up at the construction site wanting interviews he refused to give. On the 4th day, he called the number Melissa Court had left in a follow-up text. "I'll take the job," he said, "on one condition." "Name it. I need to be home every night by 6. "Sophie can't be alone. I won't negotiate on that." "Done." The answer came so quickly that Mark wondered if she'd anticipated this exact request. "Report to my office Monday morning, 8 sharp. I'll have the paperwork ready. Anything else?" "Yes." Mark hesitated, then pushed forward. "I need to understand something. You could hire anyone. Former Secret Service, military special ops, people with actual experience protecting high-value targets. Why me? Because those people think in protocols and procedures. They follow playbooks written by someone else. You think in instincts. You saw a crisis and you acted, not because a manual told you to, but because something in you couldn't do otherwise. That's what I need. Someone who will see the danger I don't see, who will act when others hesitate. Can you be that person, Mr. Richards? I can try. Trying isn't enough. I need you to succeed." Mark thought about Sophie, about the shoes with holes, about the nights he lay awake calculating which bills to pay and which to let slide another month. He thought about his wife, about the promise he'd made her at the end, that he would give their daughter everything, every opportunity, every chance at a life that didn't involve the kind of calculations he made every night at that kitchen table. "I'll succeed," he said. "Good. See you Monday." That weekend, Mark sat Sophie down and tried to explain the change that was coming. In their small apartment, the one with the water stain on the ceiling and the window that wouldn't close all the way, and Sophie listened with the grave attention of a child who had learned too young that life was complicated. "So you're going to work for the lady you saved," she said when he finished. "That's right." "And we're going to have more money?" "Yes." "And I can get new shoes?" Mark felt his throat tighten. "Yes, baby. You can get new shoes." Sophie was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the same intensity she brought to everything. Then she looked up at him with those eyes that were so much like her mother's and asked, "Is she nice?" The question caught him off guard. "I think so. She seemed nice, but I don't really know her yet. Sophie nodded solemnly. That's okay. You'll figure it out. You're good at figuring things out. The Court Industries building rose 40 stories into the gray sky, all glass and steel and intimidating modernity. Mark stood on the sidewalk for a full minute before entering, telling himself that he belonged here, that he had been invited, that he wasn't an imposter in a borrowed tie about to be exposed as a fraud. The lobby was marble and chrome, staffed by people in expensive suits who moved with the confidence of those who had never worried about keeping the heat on. A security guard directed him to an elevator that required a special key card, and Mark rode alone to the executive floor, watching the numbers climb with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Melissa Court's office was not what he expected. He'd imagined something cold and clinical, all sharp angles and minimalist design, the kind of space that proclaimed power without warmth. Instead, he found himself in a room filled with plants and soft light, bookshelves crammed with well-worn volumes, photographs on the walls that showed a younger Melissa with people who looked like family. She rose from behind her desk when he entered, and Mark was struck again by how different she looked from the woman he'd dragged from a burning car. The gash on her forehead was covered by a small bandage, barely visible beneath her styled hair. She wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than his truck, but her smile was genuine, reaching all the way to those green eyes that had haunted him since the accident. "Mr. Richards," she extended her hand. "Thank you for coming." Mark shook it, noting the firmness of her grip. "Just Mark is fine. Then call me Melissa." She gestured to a chair across from her desk. "Please sit. We have a lot to discuss." She spent the next hour explaining the position in detail. As head of security, he would be responsible for her personal safety, coordinating with the larger security team that protected the building and company assets. He would accompany her to meetings, travel with her when necessary, and maintain constant awareness of potential threats. The salary she quoted made him dizzy. He tried not to let it show, but she must have noticed something in his expression because she paused mid-sentence and studied him with those penetrating eyes. "Is there a problem?" "No," Mark said. "It's just a lot to take in." "I'm sure it is." She leaned back in her chair. "Can I be honest with you, Mark? Please, I didn't offer you this job entirely out of gratitude. I did extensive research on you over the past few days. I know about your military service, the 4 years you spent in the Army before your wife got sick. I know you received commendations for your performance in combat situations. I know you left the service early to be with her during her treatment, and that you've been struggling ever since she died." Mark's jaw tightened. "That's a lot of research. I told you I have resources. The point is, you're not just some random good Samaritan. You have training, instincts, a background that makes you uniquely suited for this kind of work. Yes, I'm grateful that you saved my life, but I'm also a businesswoman. I don't make decisions based purely on emotion. You're the right person for this job. I believe that. Do you?" The question hung between them, a challenge wrapped in sincerity. Mark thought about all the years he'd spent feeling like less than what he was, like the world had decided his worth the day he dropped out of college to work construction, the day his wife died and left him alone with a child and a mountain of medical debt. He thought about what it would mean to be valued for something other than his ability to pour concrete and swing a hammer. "I want to believe it," he said honestly. "That's a start." She stood, signaling that the formal part of their meeting was over. "Come, I'll introduce you to the team." The next few weeks were a blur of training and orientation. Mark learned the layout of the building, the names and faces of key employees, the daily rhythm of Melissa Court's life. He studied threat assessment protocols, practiced defensive driving, familiarized himself with the security systems that protected both the executive floor and Melissa's private residence. He was good at it, better than he'd expected. The military training came back to him like muscle memory, and the years of construction work had given him a physical awareness that translated surprisingly well to personal protection. He noticed things others missed, subtle shifts in behavior, small details that didn't quite fit the pattern of normal activity. Melissa noticed too. She told him so one evening about 3 weeks into his employment as he was reviewing the security arrangements for an upcoming charity gala. "You were right about the catering company," she said, appearing in the doorway of his small office. Her voice was quieter than usual, less certain. "How did you know?" "Know what?" "That one of their employees had a criminal record, that he'd been arrested twice for stalking." "I didn't know," Mark said carefully. "I just noticed that his application had a gap in his work history that didn't add up, and his references felt rehearsed when I called them. Something felt off, so I dug deeper." "So you followed your instincts." "I followed my instincts." She was quiet for a moment, standing in the doorway with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then she said, "My previous security head would have missed that. He would have looked at the paperwork, seen that everything was in order, and moved on. You didn't, because paperwork lies. People don't. Not really. Not if you know how to look." She stepped into the office, closing the door behind her, and for the first time Mark noticed the tiredness around her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands that she was trying to hide. "You're exhausted," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm fine. With respect, that's not true. You've had back-to-back meetings for the past 3 days. You skipped lunch today and yesterday. Your hands are shaking, which means your blood sugar is probably crashing." He stood, moving past her to the small refrigerator he'd installed in the corner of his office. He pulled out a sandwich, one of the extras he'd started keeping for days when he didn't have time for a proper meal. "Eat this." He held it out to her. She stared at the sandwich as if he'd offered her something foreign and incomprehensible. "You made me a sandwich?" "I made myself several sandwiches. You're having one of them." "You're not my caretaker, Mark." "No, I'm your security, and part of keeping you safe is making sure you don't collapse from exhaustion or hunger. Now eat." Something shifted in her expression, some wall crumbling that he hadn't even known was there. She took the sandwich, sat down in the chair across from his desk, and ate in silence while he pretended to return to his computer screen. "This is good," she said finally, between bites. "My daughter makes them. She's very particular about the ratio of peanut butter to jelly." Melissa smiled, a real smile that softened her features and made her look younger, more vulnerable. "How is Sophie?" "She's good. She's started asking when she can meet you." Mark paused, suddenly uncertain whether he'd crossed a line. "She saw your picture in a magazine and decided you have nice hair." "Nice hair." Those were her exact words. Melissa laughed, and the sound was surprising in its warmth, so different from the controlled professional tone she used in meetings. "I'll take that as a compliment. I'd like to meet her too, if that's appropriate." Mark hesitated. The line between professional and personal was something he'd been careful to maintain, a boundary that protected both of them from complications neither needed. But Sophie had been asking, and Melissa was looking at him with those green eyes that seemed to see right through every wall he'd built, and he found himself nodding before he could think better of it. "I'll arrange something," he said. "Good." She stood, brushing crumbs from her suit with a self-consciousness that seemed uncharacteristic. "Thank you, for the sandwich, and for everything else. It's my job." "No." She met his eyes, and there was something in her gaze that he couldn't quite name. "It's more than that. You treat me like a person, Mark. Not like a CEO or a billionaire or a target to be protected. Just a person. You don't know how rare that is in my world." The charity gala arrived on a Friday evening in late October, held in the grand ballroom of a hotel that probably charged more for a night's stay than Mark used to make in a month. He'd spent the week reviewing every detail, every entrance and exit, every face on the guest list and catering staff. He'd run scenarios with the security team, established communication protocols, prepared for every contingency he could imagine. But he hadn't prepared for the way Melissa looked when she emerged from her private suite, wearing a gown of deep emerald that matched her eyes. He hadn't prepared for the way his breath caught or the way she smiled at him as if they shared a secret that no one else in the world would understand. "You look different," she said as he escorted her to the elevator. Mark glanced down at his tuxedo, A rental that had required 3 attempts to get the fit right. Different good or different bad? Different like you might actually pass for civilized. He snorted. Don't get used to it, I'm already uncomfortable. She laughed, and the sound echoed in the elevator car as they descended to the ballroom level. Stay close to me, she murmured as the doors opened onto a sea of glittering people. He did, through the receiving line, where she greeted donors and board members with practiced grace, through the cocktail hour where she navigated conversations with an ease that seemed effortless but he suspected was anything but, through the dinner where she sat at the head table and he stood along the wall with the other security personnel, watching, always watching. It was during her speech that he noticed the man. Nothing obvious, nothing that would have triggered an alarm in most people. But there was something about the way he stood, too still among the shifting crowd, his eyes fixed on Melissa with an intensity that raised the hair on the back of Mark's neck. He moved before he consciously decided to, weaving through the tables with a casual purpose that belied the urgency building in his chest. The man didn't notice him until Mark was close enough to see the slight bulge beneath his jacket, the sheen of sweat on his forehead, the wild desperation in his eyes. "Excuse me," Mark said quietly. "I need you to come with me." The man's hand twitched toward his jacket. "Don't do that." Mark's voice was low and steady. "Whatever you're planning, it's not worth it. Think about what happens next. Think about who gets hurt. You don't understand." The man's voice cracked. "She destroyed my life. Her company, their drugs, they killed my wife. I have nothing left. Nothing. I understand more than you know." Mark thought of his own wife, of the months he'd spent watching her slip away, of the rage that had burned in him when there was nothing he could do to stop it. But this isn't the way. This doesn't bring her back. It doesn't fix anything. It just creates more pain, more loss. Is that what your wife would want? The man's hand dropped, his shoulders slumped. The fight went out of him in a single breath, leaving behind only grief and exhaustion and the hollow emptiness of a man who had lost everything. Mark signaled to the other security personnel, who materialized from the crowd to escort the man away quietly without disruption. Melissa continued her speech, unaware of how close she had come to catastrophe. It wasn't until later, after the guests had departed and the ballroom had emptied, that Mark told her what happened. They were in her office, the late hour casting long shadows across the floor, and Melissa listened with a stillness that he recognized as shock. "He had a gun," she said when he finished. "Yes, and you just walked up to him and talked him down. What if he had shot you? Then at least he wouldn't have shot you." She stared at him, something breaking open behind her eyes. "Why? Why would you do that? You could have been killed." "Because it's my job." "No, stop saying that." She stood, moving toward him with an intensity that made him take a step back. "This isn't about the job. It was never about the job. You don't risk your life for a paycheck, Mark." "So why? Why do you keep saving me?" He thought about the question, really thought about it, and the answer that rose to his lips surprised him with its honesty. "Because someone should. Because you matter. Not because of your money or your company or what you can do for people. Just because you're a person, and people deserve to be protected. You deserve to be protected." She was very close now, close enough that he could see the slight trembling of her lower lip, the tears gathering in her eyes. "Do you know how long it's been since someone saw me that way? Just as a person. I was a symbol to my father, a legacy to be shaped. I was a competitor to my business rivals, a trophy to the men who wanted to date me. Even my friends, they see Melissa Court, CEO. They don't see me." She reached up, and before he could react, her fingers were brushing his cheek with a tenderness that made his heart stutter. "But you do. From the moment you pulled me out of that car, you've seen me, the real me." Mark caught her hand gently, lowering it from his face. "Melissa, I can't. I work for you. Right now, in this moment, you don't work for me. Right now, you're just Mark, and I'm just Melissa, and I'm asking you to stop pretending you don't feel what I feel." When he kissed her, it was nothing like the CPR. There was no desperation, no fear, no racing against death. It was soft and slow and full of questions they were only beginning to ask. His phone buzzed, Sophie's babysitter, reminding him that his daughter needed to be picked up. Melissa stepped back, a smile playing at her lips despite the tears still shining in her eyes. "Go," she said. "Your daughter needs you." "This isn't finished," Mark said. "No, it's just beginning." Sophie and Melissa met at a small park near their apartment the following Sunday. Mark watched with a mixture of wonder and terror as his daughter peppered the billionaire with questions about her favorite color and whether she liked butterflies and if she knew how to do a cartwheel. Melissa answered each question with grave seriousness, admitted that her cartwheel skills were severely lacking, and accepted Sophie's offer to teach her with a solemnity that made Mark's heart ache. By the end of the afternoon, Sophie had declared that Melissa was her new best friend, and Melissa had grass stains on her designer jeans and a smile that Mark suspected she hadn't worn in years. But not everyone shared Sophie's enthusiasm. Richard Blackwood, the company's CFO, made it clear from their first meeting that he considered Mark beneath contempt. Blackwood had been with Cord Industries for 15 years, had risen through the ranks by knowing which backs to stab and which hands to shake, and he viewed Mark as both a threat to his influence and an insult to everything he believed about how the world should work. "Interesting hiring choice," Blackwood said during a meeting where Mark was presenting security updates. "Do we usually let the help sit at the executive table now?" Mark felt Melissa stiffen beside him, but he spoke before she could. "Mr. Blackwood, I've reviewed the security protocols you approved last year, the ones that allowed 3 unauthorized personnel to access the building using expired credentials. I've also noticed some interesting discrepancies in the expense reports for the protective services you contracted before my arrival. Would you like to discuss that, or should we stay focused on the topic at hand?" Blackwood's face went red. "Are you accusing me of something?" "I'm asking a question. There's a difference. But if you'd like to continue this conversation elsewhere, I'm happy to show you the documents I've been reviewing." The room went silent. Melissa's hand found Mark's under the table, squeezing once in silent support. Blackwood glared at him for a long moment, then gathered his things and left without another word. "You just made an enemy," Melissa said quietly after the meeting. "I've had enemies before. The difference now is that I have something worth protecting." The word landed between them, heavy with implication. Melissa's eyes widened. "Your family?" Mark hesitated, suddenly uncertain. I know what you meant." She took his hands. "I want to be your family, Mark. Yours and Sophie's. If you'll have me." "I'll have you," he said. "But you need to understand what you're getting. I work too hard. Sophie has nightmares sometimes. I'm not rich. I can't give you. You gave me my life. You gave me someone who sees me as a person instead of a portfolio. That's worth more than anything." The engagement was announced 3 months later, to the shock of the business world and the delight of Sophie, who immediately began planning a wedding that would feature butterflies and a chocolate fountain. But Blackwood, it turned out, had been embezzling from Cord Industries for years. When Mark's investigation uncovered the full extent of the theft, Blackwood's response was swift and vicious. The anonymous email included photos of Sophie at her school, at the park. The message was simple: withdraw your accusations, resign, break off your engagement, or the next photos will be from her funeral. Mark's blood ran cold. He showed Melissa, who reached for the phone to call police. Mark stopped her. "Give me 48 hours to find him and end this." He moved Sophie and Mrs. Patterson, their elderly neighbor who had become like a grandmother to his daughter, to a secure location. He called in favors from his military days, and he set a trap. The warehouse was the kind of place that existed in the margins of the city, forgotten by everyone who didn't need to hide something. Mark arrived alone, knowing that Blackwood's paranoia wouldn't allow him to walk into a meeting that included anyone else. The CFO was waiting, flanked by 2 men who looked like they'd seen the inside of a prison more than once. I didn't think you'd actually come, Blackwood said. You threatened my daughter. There was nowhere else I was going to be. Mark pulled out his phone. While we've been talking, your men have been arrested at the locations you sent them to this morning. The police have warrants for every property you own, and my lawyer has instructions to release everything I've gathered to every major news outlet if I don't check in within the hour. Blackwood's face went white. You couldn't have known. I've been watching you for months. You underestimated me because I used to pour concrete, because I don't have a degree from the right school. But the skills that kept me alive in combat, that let me see through your schemes, don't come from money. They come from surviving, from paying attention, from never giving up. The police arrived 12 minutes later, finding Blackwood secured with zip ties. The victory felt hollow until Mark walked through the safe house door and saw Sophie running toward him, crying, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy." "I was scared," she whispered. "I know, baby. But it's over now. We're safe." The wedding took place 6 months later on a spring day when flowers were blooming. Sophie was the flower girl, scattering butterflies instead of petals. Mrs. Patterson sat in the front row dabbing at her eyes. When the officiant asked if he took this woman to be his wife, Mark said I do with a certainty he'd thought he'd never feel again. And when Sophie asked later if she could call Melissa Mommy now, both adults said yes through tears. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were competitors who tried to use Mark's background against Melissa, whispered about whether the CEO was making decisions with her heart instead of her head. But Mark had learned something important. The people who questioned his worth were usually most threatened by it. He didn't need to prove anything. He just needed to show up, pay attention, and protect the people he loved. Sophie grew up with two parents who adored her, becoming the kind of person who stopped to help strangers, who believed ordinary people could do extraordinary things because she'd watched her father do exactly that. On the 10th anniversary of the accident, Mark and Melissa drove to that stretch of coastal highway. They stood together looking out at the ocean. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't been there?" she asked. "Every day. The 1,000 small choices that put me on that road at that exact moment. Any one of them goes differently and we never meet." "Do you know what I remember most?" Melissa said. "Waking up with your face above mine, asking why you kissed me. And your answer. It was CPR.